Hi, everyone. I'm Emily with Polar Bears International, and thank you for joining us here today for our second Conservation Happy Hour in 2023. We'll be talking about the role that zoos play in conservation today, and this topic spans across department at Polar Bears International, touching our research team, science team, our outreach and programs teams, and our policy teams. So you'll get to hear from quite a few different voices today who are sharing that work. And we're really excited to kind of bring you into that work and connect you to those stories. And with that, I will pass it over to Amy Cutting, our Vice President of Conservation, to get us started.
Hello, thanks everybody. It's great to see you. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We are looking forward to spending a little time doing a deep dive on some of our programs here at Polar Bears International. And as always, we appreciate you joining us. Today, we're going to really get into our long history of working closely with accredited zoos and aquariums. For over 20 years now, we've had a relationship with key partners in the zoo and aquarium community on a variety of aspects of conservation. We participate in research, we are invested in animal welfare efforts, education and outreach, and even advocacy and trying to move the needle on policy. Working closely and collaboratively with zoos 20 years ago was a pretty different approach for non-governmental organizations. And there were definitely folks who were wondering whether we should be in close contact with zoos. And at the time, our founders, Robert and Carolyn Buchanan, actually went to some zoo meetings and decided they were going to get to know the folks in that community and make a decision about what kind of relationships we might have. And they found that zoos provide incredible opportunities for a variety of things you'll hear about, and that they're also populated with passionate wildlife conservation professionals. And we really demonstrated over the years that those partnerships are key to our efforts. And I think what's interesting to me is that now, 20 years later, the IUCN encourages this one plan approach, which is really all stakeholders for a species or an ecosystem coming together and working collaboratively. And I do think that Polar Bears International was on the forefront of that vision. So really excited to talk about it today. We'll be talking with Jeff York, who's our Senior Director of Conservation, about the research side of things, and then moving over to Marisa Krause, who's our Director of Conservation Programs, about our Arctic Ambassador Center. So I was going to start with Jeff. You've done a lot of research with polar bears over the years, primarily in the field. What's the advantage of working with zoos and aquariums?
There are a lot of things we can only do in the wild, really figuring out natural bear behavior, what kind of habitat they use, but there are also lots of questions we can't answer very well in the wild. And that has a lot to do with accessibility, reproducibility, control, and things like that. So working with our accredited zoo partners, we get a skilled and eager team. These are experts often in animal behavior, animal training. They can, through training, get bears to participate voluntarily in research and sample collection, which is super cool. We have direct observations of animals, and in some facilities, this can be 24/7 in that sense. And we can really get some interesting sample sizes, both total numbers, but also specifically for gender and age, if we combine North American and European zoos.
For sure. Yeah, Ray's got a video up now of some maternity den footage, and I think sometimes people don't realize this has never been seen in the wild before. Is that true?
That's true. We haven't found anybody to volunteer to go up and stick a camera in a den with a female polar bear inside. So some of this information on reproduction in this critical phase, we only know from captive animals because it's almost impossible. I won't say it's impossible. Someday somebody might figure it out. But it's been very difficult to instrument dens in the wild in any sense. Most parts of the Arctic polar bears are denning in snow caves. They're not reused. And so that challenges that aspect. But you can see the kind of information we can get from some of our higher performing zoo partners here that have the capacity to have the technology in their den spaces and also have the staff to document this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think when people think about traditional research in the field with polar bears, it's difficult to make a connection to how something in the zoo could connect to the field. What kinds of information would you say can really only be collected in a zoo setting?
Sure, denning was definitely one of them. Another great example early on was what do bears hear and how can we figure that out? Well, we certainly can't do it very well in the wild, but in a captive setting, we can do hearing tests. And we had captive partners step up and develop the tools and techniques to make that happen. So we can actually have, audiograms of what polar bears can hear and then tie that back to disturbance or potential disturbance. We can look at energetics. Some of the photos you see here are bears participating in an energetics or several energetic studies where we're looking at what's the cost to polar bears in calories of walking, what's the cost of running, what's the cost of swimming, and how do those compare? Again, things we can answer in the wild, but are critical, especially as sea ice melts. Some bears are swimming more and for longer distances. And what does that mean energetically to polar bears? There we can look at reproductive hormones. Again, the reproductive side of polar bears is still, somewhat mysterious in the wild because they den in the dark of winter in the high Arctic and they disappear into the snow. So there's a lot going on there that we only know through our collaborations with some of our captive partners there. So yeah, just some examples.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people it's easy to forget how infrequently a polar bear biologist actually sees a polar bear. Maybe during your field season you're out there and you see a few, but there's very few direct observation capabilities in the field for this species. And so while, a bear in a zoo setting may not be behaving and doing the same things a polar bear in the wild would, at the very least, you get to actually directly observe them. But what about those, the technologies that people use to learn about these bears remotely and kind of continuing to refine those? That feels like when I was at Oregon Zoo, I know there was a lot of that kind of work that people are asking us to do, is to help them sort of calibrate new technologies. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, the technology side has been very productive with our collaborations there, and that some of those energetic studies you saw, some of the captive bears had collars on. Those collars were put on bears without sedation through training. Those collars had accelerometers on them that are what we call triaxial accelerometers to be specific, but it's the same thing that's in your cell phone. It knows up, down, how fast it's moving and provides all this data. Well, we've been putting collars with accelerometers on bears in the wild for years. We just didn't know what the data meant. So it wasn't until we could put collars on bears in zoos, watch what they're doing to get the data we need to interpret that collar information. So a key thing there, we had been collecting data without any ability to decode it. We got that ability to decode through our captive partners. We've also been working for a while now. I think many folks listening will know about our Detect to Protect project, the radar detection work. Example of the tower there in Churchill, looking out on the Churchill River. And what we've become very good at is bear detection. These radar systems in general are very good at detecting things out in that Arctic landscape. What we're working on is bear identification. We'd rather alert a conservation officer only if it's a bear or bear-like object, not if it's a fox or a rabbit or a caribou or a moose. And so we're working with captive partners to get these radar systems set up in a place where they can get repeated measurements of bears doing different things, coming in and out of the water, moving around on these, especially larger captive spaces, to fine tune that. And then we're also looking at different types of tracking technologies.
Interesting. All right. So you mentioned Burr on Fur, and that's Polar Bears International. A lot of these other things you've mentioned, we have been collaborating with partners, but Burr on Fur really came from you and your team at PBI. Can you talk about what we're learning and how we're applying what we're learning in the zoos?
Sure. So I've been fortunate to have gone out at something like 16 years of doing capture out on the sea ice, mostly in Alaska there. And, over that time, I feel a great deal of debt to polar bears for giving me those opportunities, allowing me, in a sense, to interrupt their lives and get information. And so I've always had an interest in how can we make some of that less invasive? How can we improve our techniques continually, whether that's through sedation and darting or whether that's through tracking. And so back in 2016, we convened a working group at the International Bear Association meeting, and I raised our hand at PBI to come up with a tag that we could try to attach to polar bear fur. A lot of different attempts have been made over the years with limited success, and various attachments, including surgical attachments, subcutaneous, ear tags, all things that have risk of injuring bears. So we just wanted to see, could we come up with something that just used the fur, didn't require shaving, and because polar bears molt every summer, know that the fur itself would act as a natural release mechanism and let the tag drop off. So we partnered with 3M and quickly developed a lot of prototypes, several of which you can see here, but then how to test those. And our approach was kind of an everything on the table approach, where we started working with both captive and wild partners in real time to get tags out in both of those settings. In the wild, when a tag fails, we have no idea what happened. Did the tag itself fail, like the actual electronic tag fail? Did the tag fall off the bear? And was it still transmitting on the ground? If it falls off and falls in the ocean, it's even more confusing. In a zoo setting, we have eyes on those bears 24/7. We get real-time feedback on, again, a fairly large sample size, relatively quickly on just protocols for attaching these tags. How did it work? What did you see when you were putting it on? Do you have any suggestions for improvement? What happened when the tag came off? What was the bear doing, or not doing? And so through those iterations, we were able to quickly modify the tag in real time. And you can see a picture here of a tag that came off, and some fur still on it, but fairly roughed up there. So we changed material. We went to a completely different fabric from a ballistic, basically what you'd see in a bulletproof vest to what you see here is a rubber raft hypalon material. And then the same thing with the copper crimps in this particular tag. They were just the crimps by themselves. We realized that wasn't sufficient. So we added those little ferrules at the bottom of the tag. That was all through information and feedback we got through zoo partners. We just had an attachment with partners at Kansas City Zoo here in Missouri, and they were, I think, the longest attachment for the type of tag that they put on. They also put on one of those pentagonal crimp tags there, and luckily for us, they had a failure that we hadn't seen before. The tag itself, or the little box on the tag came off, but the tag stayed on the bear. So we have one more thing to shore up. And again, we wouldn't have even known to think about that if it wasn't for a partnership with our zoos.
And what's the comparison been like for, I mean, there have been some in-field deployments of these tags. Are zoo bears harder on them or bears in the field? And do you have ideas about why?
It turns out bears in captivity are Houdinis at getting these things off. They tend to come off within 24 hours. I think Kansas City, Maurice will have to correct me later. We had several days of that tag staying on, which was great to see there. And we think it's most likely behavioral in a captive setting. Polar bears are very well taken care of. They're fed, they have all their needs met. There are no threats. Most of them are very relaxed animals. And so they can spend a lot of time thinking about what's this thing on my back and how can I get it off? And they seem to do that. There is an outside chance there could be differences in the strength of fur itself or the strength of their hair follicles due to differences in diet. Polar bears in captivity do have a different diet than polar bears in the wild. And so we're also starting to look into that as a simple question, but we think it's probably more on the behavioral side.
Okay, interesting. Well, I guess you mentioned differences in captive bears versus wild bears potentially, and sometimes I hear that it might be a concern that polar bears are at different latitudes, and so some of the things that we learn aren't relevant. How do you think that impacts the data that we're collecting?
Captive facilities actually provide a pretty unique opportunity in that sense too, where we have polar bears living in different geographies than they do in the real world. And we get a couple of things from that. We know in the wild, in places like Southern Hudson and Western Hudson Bay, polar bears exist in a very wide temperature range, anywhere from centigrade plus 30, so what we'd say 90 in the US, down to minus 40, minus 50. So they can tolerate a pretty wide swing there. But what we find out, or what we can potentially find out from having bears in all these different geographies and associating, in a sense, with other species in near proximity, is what disease potential specifically we might have to worry about as the Arctic warms and we see northern species shifting into the Arctic and just more human activity in the Arctic. And so captive facilities are very likely an early harbinger of disease vectors that could potentially impact polar bears.
Interesting. Okay. I'm noticing some of these black patches on the bears that we're seeing pictures of in zoos and aquariums. And I happen to know that's because they're shaving those spots often for blood draws or other kinds of issues. But it reminded me, you mentioned that some zoos have trained bears to wear research collars. Has anybody been working on applying this burr on fur tag without it having to be during a routine anesthesia?
We do have partners working on this, and kind of related to that question on hair strength, some of those patches are from facilities shaving bears so we can look at hair growth. Another thing we don't know much about in polar bears, how quickly does hair grow? When does it grow? When does the molt occur? Is there variation in molt depending on where the bear is kept, geographically, or is it similar to what we'd see in the wild? So those are other pieces of the puzzle that partners are working with our zoo collaborators on that are pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess time of year that you're applying the tag would matter too, whether you've got new short hair coming in or you've got long guard hair getting ready to molt. So lots of variables. Okay. Well, I'm sure that our audience will have questions for you, but I think we'll round them all up at the end, and we're gonna pivot now over to sort of our outreach side of the house. And we're going to talk with Marisa Kraus, who's our Director of Conservation Programs. And Marisa, you lead our Arctic Ambassador Center network of 50 plus zoos and aquariums committed to partnering with us on conservation outreach. Why zoos? Why is that the direction we're going?
That's a great question, Amy. I think equally as important as the research that we're doing, it's collaborative and it involves a lot of partners, is the opportunity for public outreach and for climate action and to share the polar bear story. We know that AZA accredited institutions see more than 180 million visitors a year. And you could, just as an analogy for that, more visitors come through the gates at zoos and aquariums in North America alone than all major sporting events in North America, which is just this incredible reach, right, of a diverse audience coming through those gates. And we also know from the social science research that the public trusts zoos and aquariums, and often with a higher level of trust even than NGOs have, right? And we also know that visitors expect zoos and aquariums to be communicating about species conservation and what can be done. And then it improves their experience when they're visiting the zoo. So we're incredibly grateful for all of our Arctic Ambassador Centers expanding our reach. And like Amy mentioned previously, 2024 will mark our 20th anniversary of sort of this commitment, this shared commitment to polar bear research, education, and action programming with our Arctic Ambassador Center network. And I've seen several of our Arctic Ambassador Center contacts and alumni chiming in here. I can't focus totally on the chat, so I haven't been able to see everybody on there, but if there's folks from the Maryland Zoo, we celebrated last year at the AZA conference. They were one of the founding members of the Arctic Ambassador Center network in 2004, which is just incredible. And since then, we've been able to build the network to 50 accredited institutions that we work with across the US, Canada, and Europe. And those are spread throughout 25 US states, 4 Canadian provinces, Austria, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, France, and Belgium, which I think is just incredible. And
that really is incredible growth.
It really is. And when you think about the opportunity that zoos and aquariums have to work together and sort of, how we can all have this shared commitment to polar bear conservation through the AAC network, we can also partner with other institutions that have similar goals, right? And similar goals of weaving networks. And so we also work with the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, working with zoos and aquariums and other informal science centers to, streamline our messaging regarding the polar bear story of polar bears and climate change to be consistent and to be positive, civic-minded, and solutions-focused. As we're a science-based organization, we want to weave in the social science as well. And so we're grateful for those partners.
Thanks. So what do those collaborations look like? What are some of the major, elements and collaborations that we're working on?
Right. So, we have those 3 pillars. We talked about research, there's education, outreach, and climate action programming. And Arctic Ambassador Centers come into an agreement with Polar Bears International. And in that agreement, we offer things that we solely offer to the AAC network as some of our most important partners. And so Arctic Ambassador Centers receive an interpretive kit and commit to using that interpretive kit with biofacts like a skull or claws or tracking devices so that they can link, the ambassadors that they have right in front of them at the zoo with species conservation in the wild. Our Arctic Ambassador Centers are participating in our awareness campaigns that we do 3 times a year. So they're doing social media campaigns, sharing our free online curriculum and offering tabling events and special events for International Polar Bear Day every year on February 27th. They're participating in Arctic Sea Ice Day on July 15th. And that's also often where we see Arctic Ambassador Centers plugging in who don't necessarily have polar bears in their care, but they can link it to maybe other sea ice dependent species or Arctic species at their institutions. And then of course, Polar Bear Week, which is when we're doing a full week of outreach, typically live from the tundra and the Churchill Wildlife Management Area via Tundra Buggy One and our Tundra Connections programming. And so they're sharing that with their viewers, they're sharing it with their educational partners. Sometimes they're often incorporating our live cams or Tundra Connections into some of the interpretive spaces at their exhibits, along with the Bear Tracker program. And, you know, we also offer a full media library solely to our Arctic Ambassador Centers. And so when teams are updating interpretives at their exhibits, or they're creating distance learning programs or social media campaigns, we can offer special toolkits, but they can also reach out for targeted assets that just their team is looking for. And then, of course, we also offer opportunities for our network of scientists and PBI staff to visit Arctic Ambassador Centers upon request. And so you can see myself and Amy there visiting the Buffalo Zoo, which we did this winter, along with the Seneca Park Zoo. And, you know, Jeff mentioned earlier about the Kansas City Zoo deploying one of the burr on fur tags, and it was the longest tag for the crimp plate tag, the newest version of it. I think it was 10 or 11 days to stay attached. And the other one was the tri-brush that was almost a month, which was incredible. But on that note, you know, Jeff and our executive director, Krista, were at the Kansas City Zoo and had almost a week long of outreach in which the zoo organized a media interview, a scientist lecture series in which people came to see Krista and Jeff speak. They did a live outreach with their distance learning program with local schools. And so we're just so, you know, we're so grateful, but also like just so surprised every time we're visiting one of our Arctic Ambassador Centers. They're so innovative and creative and thinking about how to place themselves in a leadership position in their community and work with different partners to share that polar bear story out. I'm going to pivot a little bit to, you know, you might be asking yourself, well, how in the world, you know, do you get these large institutions that are employing hundreds of people to come together and focus, you know, because they're focusing on, they have a lot of conservation goals, right, that involve more species than polar bears. And so one of our keystone programs in which we build capacity for Arctic Ambassador Centers to be doing this work is our Climate Alliance program. And I saw several folks tuning in the chat. So I won't be able to point you out individually, but super happy to have you joining. Climate Alliance is a program in which we work with a different audience every year. So last year it was an animal care cohort. This year we're working with education staff and also several animal care staff. We've also worked with marketing and communications staff in the past. And so we alternate that key audience every year. And we're building community online for about 8 months, building literacy in polar bear natural history and climate science. We're working with NOKI to build skills in effective climate communications. And then at the end of this, we have a shared experience in the self-proclaimed polar bear capital of the world, Churchill, Manitoba. And, you know, I'll just say that a lot of these staff see polar bears, you know, they might see polar bears every day, like you mentioned, at the zoos and aquariums in which they work. But seeing polar bear in the wild with this community of folks that you're leaning on, you've formed lifelong bonds with, is a really powerful jumping off point for, you know, affirming your commitment to the mission and for forming a powerful action plan moving forward and thinking about what your spheres of influence are and how am I going to plug into my Arctic Ambassador Center team at home? What are people already doing? How can I bring my skills to the table to strengthen what we're doing? And so it really builds capacity for all of the programs, you know, that we outline sort of in our Arctic Ambassador Center agreement and that we're working together to share the polar bear story with. So we're just super.
You know, this year, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, you know, I learn something I learn something new every year from Climate Alliance. You know, we've just got all these incredible professionals and conservationists and some of those passionate people I know. You know, and I learned something every year from someone. And even I think just this year, you know, we've been kind of talking about, we've been going through some of the online learning, and we have sort of a private social space that we're using to build community. And someone in the cohort mentioned recently using our polar bear tracker as a tool in programming to connect teen and youth to individual bears and to build empathy, which, you know, I thought was incredible. So we're just super grateful that all of these institutions also are supporting their staff to participate in this program.
Absolutely. It's a significant commitment. And, you know, this last year was my first year at Climate Alliance. And what I was really struck by is that these folks, these people they're the front line, right? They're out there every single day, talking to colleagues, talking to the public, pushing people to think about climate and their impacts on the planet, and to, you know, become advocates. And they're out there in these communities throughout the world now, really doing the heavy lifting. And it's really cool to see how passionate they are, and to give them the tools to be able to go out and do that effectively with, like you said, the social science-based information. But I just super impressed again with, I talked about these zoo conservation professionals and the passion that they bring to the work, and they are this front line that we're able to engage and support. It's really very cool.
It is.
Okay, well, I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for policy and advocacy, but let's talk about if you have a handful of activities that Arctic Ambassador Centers have done that you think are particularly clever or reach a unique audience that you just want to highlight.
Absolutely. So, you know, we could probably have a conservation happy hour for hours and just go over, it would be very difficult to go over all of these incredibly innovative and creative programs that these folks are creating. And as our team builds capacity this year, that's actually one of our goals, is to kind of extract that information for people more. And I'm excited to be able to get to do that so we can share those stories. But I will say that because we work with so many partners and we're a relatively small team, and sort of there's been a shift in how often folks are doing virtual programming, and we've seen that increase over the years since the pandemic, is that we have to find a way to prioritize some of the things that we're doing. And that's especially when that involves like a direct connection. So in the fall, we do our Tundra Connections programming that are regularly scheduled, and folks can tune into that live from the tundra, right? And it's not necessarily connecting with one Arctic Ambassador Center or one school in particular. But we do offer direct connections with PBI scientists and graduate students and staff. And so the way that we prioritize that is for supporting the conservation education departments at these AACs that are committed to working with historically underserved members of their community. And so I'll just briefly kind of touch on I'm just going to kind of call out a couple of those, because I think you know, the work that they're doing is so important. For the past several years, we've been able to connect with Henry Vilas Zoo's after school program, and you can kind of see that picture up there with that little cutie connecting with that polar bear. And this is a program that supports community members by providing safe places to virtually school. And of course, after this pandemic, homework help and meals. And so we've offered direct connections with that program for the past couple of years, and sent different educational materials and supporting materials for that. This year, we were so honored in an additional program to be able to participate. Louisville Zoo, we've been working for them for almost 20 years. You know, they reached out about a program that they've been doing called the Zoo's Future Healers Got Zoo Buddies program. And this is a program in which it sort of takes a One Health approach and connecting communities and building empathy. And it's for community members and their families who've been directly and indirectly impacted by gun violence. And we were just so honored to be able to participate in that. And Dr. Louise Archer connected virtually with their team and their community members. And we were able to send some supplemental materials, and we hope that they'll ask us to do it every year. And so we were so honored to be able to do that. And then also, I don't have a picture of it, but for the past 2 years, we've also been able to work with the Toronto Zoo's Climate Action Learning and Leadership Program, offered to community members to raise awareness and build employable skills. And, we helped them build an app for that 2 years ago. And this year we offered some curriculum, sort of packaging a virtual connection with Dr. Louise Archer and some supporting curriculum for a follow-up lesson. And I know I saw Denise on there in the chat. Thanks again for including us in that program. And then, in years we haven't been able to run our youth climate action programming, Project Polar Bear. So we've been thrilled to be able to support Columbus Zoo's annual Teen Eco Summit. We've supported in the past the Youth Ambassadors event at the Lincoln Park Zoo. And then also connecting with sort of a higher ed audience with Brookfield Zoological Society's team and the Project Dragonfly's Master AIP class. So we're so grateful for all of you for reaching out, for us to plug in and share that polar bear story with those audiences. I'll just go, I know I'm like running over on my time, but the last thing I want to mention is just, I think, an incredibly brilliant program, and that's by our friends at the Seneca Park Zoo and Seneca Park Zoo Society. And this is called the Defend the Ice campaign. And this is a really just like an overarching campaign because it's, it's not only a fundraising campaign, but it's an outreach campaign and the opportunity to like connect the need for sea ice for hockey, or sorry, for cold winter weather and ice for hockey, and the need for sea ice for polar bears, because polar bears rely on the sea ice to hunt, to breed, and some to den, was just so brilliant. And we've been working with them since about 2018, I think, on this campaign. And so it offers opportunities for sharing the message via social media. There's earned media and news releases. We've done media interviews, radio interviews, tabling activities. And this is where Seneca Park Zoo connected with their local AHL hockey team, the Rochester Amherst. And they have a month-long Defend the Ice campaign in which we tie it to polar bear conservation. So sadly, I don't have hours to go on and on, but thank you for letting me do that, Amy.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of, passionate conservation professionals, we are lucky to have you, Marisa, coordinating this program. Your excitement about all of your partners out there in the zoo and aquarium community is palpable. And I confess, I am also very excited about Defend the Ice. So any of you who've talked to me recently know that I'm super stoked about that program because it's, you can grow it. If you have a zoo and a hockey team in your town, there's no reason you can't get involved, and we can help you if you're interested. It is a really excellent way to reach this audience that maybe isn't otherwise tuned into climate messaging, but certainly have a shared stake, a shared interest, like you mentioned, when it comes to winter sports. So really a clever collaboration. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about all of these many partners is they all have their own creativity and their sort of unique initiatives that we get to play a part in. And it's very inspiring. And we feel very lucky to be a part of that. All right, you're right. We could talk about this for hours. Okay, Emily, our zoo partners also play an important role, of course, in advocating for issues that impact wild polar bears in a variety of different ways. Can you give a little context for that and maybe an example before we get to the Q&A?
Yeah, I would love to. And it's easy to piggyback off of the foundation that Marisa laid because that is a really good summary of just the breadth and depth of relationships that these zoos have in their communities. So zoos tend to be really unique in their positionality, and especially in a highly partisan world. Zoos attract people with diverse interests and backgrounds and from diverse communities and people with diverse viewpoints. And they're frequently seen as sort of a nonpartisan trusted voice within their communities. They also frequently have a large soapbox, so huge reach to broad audiences through social media, a really significant and well-established digital presence. And they can also sometimes have nice relationships with elected officials within their local government, all the way up to their state government, because these institutions are frequently a point of pride within a community. And so, electeds might be bringing their families to the zoo, or, they also are influential institutions within their communities. So there's a lot of reasons that zoos are going to be connected, not just to the people, but the policymakers also within their communities. And one of, I know there are so many examples of this, and the one that I'll just share the one I experienced and witnessed most directly is in 2017, the Tax Act. It was a legislative package that opened up the potential for drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alaska is critical denning habitat for polar bears. And it's critical denning habitat for a population of polar bears that is already threatened by sea ice habitat loss. And before the possible lease sales that need to take place in order for denning, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had held a public comment period, as they are mandated to do. And we saw many zoo partners, the one I collaborated with, because I live in Oregon, in Portland. So the Oregon Zoo, I know other zoo partners participated as well, use their huge social media reaches and their email outreach to solicit public comments for this potential drilling. And they connected their community, who, is connected to the bears at their zoos, to a way to help zoos in the wild, or to a way to help bears in the wild. And another piece that Amy had participated in sort of after that public comment period was, at the time, Amy was at the Oregon Zoo, and she facilitated a conversation between U.S. Senator Berkeley in Oregon and our chief scientist at the time, Dr. Stephen Amstrup, to sort of talk about the connection between what we know about the potential threats to denning polar bears in this region posed by oil and gas development, and the policymakers in Washington, D.C., and the decisions and conversations that they're having. So, and that was all facilitated at the time by the Oregon Zoo. So, and you've heard from Marisa just how influential and large this network of Arctic Ambassador Centers really is. And you can imagine that, this is one zoo and what they did, but these institutions are all across the country and the world, and able to, when a unique opportunity presents itself, to connect their community to opportunities to advocate on behalf of polar bears. And they're also, able to connect their communities to the science and the information and the sorts of learnings and educational pieces that really help to shift public perceptions and public paradigms over time. And those also influence our policies. So we're so grateful to the entire network for the way that they advocate for practices and policies that protect polar bears, and for policies that will provoke progressive climate action and save sea ice for polar bears.
Thanks, Emily. You mentioned several times sort of how so partisan or polarized things have become, and the fact that zoos remain these trusted messengers sort of across political lines, and that people expect to hear from them about conservation issues and potential action. That's just an incredible opportunity, which we are able to leverage, hopefully, with tested messages that we know resonate with folks. But we also, in return, get this great exposure to all these incredible people and incredible programs and ideas. And it's just a really amazing partnership that we want to celebrate. And like Marisa mentioned, next year will be the 20th anniversary of the Arctic Ambassador Center Network. And it's an exciting time for us. And it's really amazing how far it's come. Okay, let's pivot to questions, shall we?
I have a couple.
What you got?
Yeah. Actually, maybe I have a couple, but I think the most natural one is we do have someone that asked, how does a zoo become an Arctic Ambassador Center, and what is that criteria? So Marisa, I imagine that's probably best suited for you.
Yes. I can hear myself. Oh, I can see myself. Okay.
Yep.
That question would go to me. So like I mentioned before, we're a relatively small team. I keep saying that, but we keep growing. At some point, I'll have to stop saying that. But, it has been, I would say, the standard pace at this point that we've had the capacity to take on a max of 2 new AACs a year. That doesn't mean that we add 2 new AACs every year. And I'll say that we work with a lot of Arctic or a lot of zoos and aquariums in different capacities that may not be an Arctic Ambassador Center. So if we don't necessarily have a shared commitment to every pillar, we're still willing to work with institutions to be able to share professional development opportunities, connect professionals at different institutions, share educational messaging. So it's sort of a long process of building a relationship. I'd say most likely Zoo Berlin and Tier Park are going to come on this year as an Arctic Ambassador Center, and we've been working with them for several years. And so sometimes it's just slowly pushing the peanut, but it usually starts with a conversation. And I'm the main contact, and somebody's welcome to reach out to me, Marisa at pbears.org, to start that conversation. And then we work with a set of advisors within AZA, IAZA, and CAZA to vet institutions. We like to be able to get over and meet the team in person. So obviously that can be harder for us if it's in Europe. But it's a conversation, and then we get, a group of stakeholders together to make a decision, and then we shoot an agreement back and forth and say, does this work for you? Or we can't necessarily meet this goal, but we really focused on this. And we just try to make it, work for everyone so that we can achieve stronger conservation goals. I hope that was a direct enough answer.
Does the zoo need to have polar bears?
No, the zoo does not need to have polar bears. And I would say, we have a handful of institutions right now that do not have polar bears in their care, right? Because action on climate change and sharing the climate change story is good for all species. So, yeah.
And can you just give, for anyone who's not familiar with AZA or IAZA, that list, just a little context for.
Sorry, when you start talking about zoos and aquariums, you can just be like throwing these acronyms around.
There are a lot.
Yeah. And so accredited institutions have an overarching body that set these accreditation standards that institutions meet in terms of animal welfare and husbandry and educational programming. And so, for instance, and I may get this wrong, but in North America, primarily, I know there's some European institutions that are accredited by AZA, but when I say AZA, I mean the Association of Zoos and Aquariums in North America. And CAZA would be Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquariums, and IAZA would be European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. I think I got all those right. Right, Amy?
Sounds right. I'm about as good with acronyms as I am with people's names, so don't ask me. But
right.
The major accrediting bodies for those institutions.
Right.
Yeah, that's perfect. It can be hard to nail all the acronyms, but I think that context is helpful for those that are less familiar with the zoo community. We have another zoo related, or actually, hold on, let me check this.
Can I give a little shout out while you're checking at your whatever you're checking?
Shout away.
So, we at PBI have our hands in different pots a lot of the time, right? And so while I don't work directly on the research team, I get to help coordinate the work with Burr on Fur with our AAC partners. And so oftentimes when our scientists like Jeff are speaking, they don't necessarily have the information in front of them to be able to call out all the partners. So I did want to just give a shout out that we tested an impressive 14 tags with 12 zoo and aquarium partners. We've got 2 primary funders for that program, which is Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium at Kansas City Zoo. Those 2 are both partners on the program as well. Columbus Zoo and Aquarium, San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, Como Park Zoo, Oregon Zoo, Louisville Zoo, Lincoln Park Zoo, Maryland Zoo in Baltimore, Utah's Hogle Zoo, Assiniboine Park Zoo, and Toronto Zoo in Canada, and Scandinavian Wildlife Park in Denmark. And not all of those institutions have necessarily deployed a tag, but are working, together with us with that conversation, or are interested in deploying one in the future. Okay.
Thanks, Marisa.
You're welcome.
That's great, and the perfect time that I needed to organize the following questions. So we have a couple more questions. Jeff, can I pull you back in here?
Certainly.
Great. Wow. Ta-da. Jeff, in your experience in the field, what has been your most difficult challenge?
Well, some days finding bears, but no, overall, I would say the biggest challenge I faced in my capture career and that my colleagues are still facing is directly from climate change. When I started working offshore in Alaska, back in 1991, the sea ice was never more than 4 to 6 miles offshore. You could see it. It came and went with the tides. There, fast forward to today, in that same area can be 300 to 500 miles offshore. So huge changes in that habitat, but that's had direct impacts on our abilities to get out and capture bears. Where sea ice is much thinner than it used to be, it's much more mobile, it's breaking up sooner and more quickly, and it makes the work dangerous. By the time I left field work, we had already given up fall fieldwork efforts and had moved just to spring capture efforts. And even today, in places like the Chukchi Sea, spring capture efforts are also nearly impossible.
Thanks, Jeff. This one is maybe this next question I'll give to, well, it might be for all three of you, but maybe I'll give it to Amy first. Can you give any examples of how collaborations between zoo and field biologists studying bears has benefited the zoo bears as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can think of one right off the bat. We were asked at Oregon Zoo years ago to do some feeding trials to look at how isotopes of different food items are laid down in the tissues. And the goal was to feed an entirely land-based diet and then an entirely marine-based diet, and taking blood and hair samples along the way to look at how those isotopes turned over in the tissues. And that was Dr. Karen Rout out of US Geological Survey. And the diets that she asked us to feed the bears were much higher in fat than what we had traditionally been feeding. We'd been feeding them more like brown bears because they don't need to do these huge oscillations of weight gain like they do in the wild. And the veterinarians and the nutritionists were very concerned about this high fat diet and that we were going to end up with obese bears with joint problems and all these things. And well, that very much did not happen. The bears looked amazing. Their weight was ideal. Their coat and skin looked amazing. And it was a no-brainer when we started thinking about it. The fact that those high fat diets are extremely normal for these animals and in fact beneficial. They've evolved to, adapted to prefer that and require it. And so that really did change how zoos feed bears, including up to and including the commercial bear diet, polar bear diet that is produced by Missouri is now much higher in fat than previous diets have been. So there are advantages to that sort of thing. I will say, I think one of the biggest advantages that I've seen when zoos are participating in research is the increased time. Well, there's a couple things for the bears and the people. The amount of time that the keepers are spending with the bears and the challenge involved in the training is enriching for the bears. They're very animals that like to solve problems. They like to be engaged and have good relationships with their keepers. And that's a great way to keep them enriched and interested in what's happening. So it's been a real benefit for them. The keepers enjoy it too and feel a much more direct connection to the conservation that they're so passionate about. So, and there's even another one on top of that, which is the storytelling opportunities for the zoos to really talk about polar bears and conservation. I'm sure there's others that I can't think of right this minute, but it does seem like each time we do a collaboration, there's also an aha moment for us about how we care for bears as well.
Thanks, Amy. This one, Jeff, back to you for this. Are they also looking at location placement? So with the Barram fur tags, are you looking at location placement within the zoo settings, as well as materials and techniques?
Definitely. And that's one thing we realized with our captive partners is they often have limited choice because they're taking advantage of a veterinary procedure that was already scheduled. And so the bear might be in a certain position for that veterinary care. And so they might not be able to put it exactly where they want, but we have gotten very good and immediate feedback on where initially we knew we wanted it somewhere between the shoulder blades and the back of the head, someplace that's harder for their paws to reach. And so we've kind of migrated up and down there trying to find a sweet spot with that. And our captive partners have been key in giving their suggestions from their experiences.
Great. And then we have one more question here, and this will maybe just be for whoever knows the answer. So how many polar bears have been born in captivity in about the last 5 years? Anyone here think they have an answer for that or an estimate?
I don't.
Yeah,
It's only a handful in the US. I know that.
right. And, there were 2 cubs just born at Toledo Zoo. Another Arctic Ambassador Center just went out on exhibit this week, I think. And yeah, I don't really know. I would, if you want guesses, I might say 4 or 5.
Well, I think over the last 5 years, it's probably closer to 10 or in North America. But in Europe, significantly more. They produce a number. They have a much more active breeding program due to just having more space than we do. We sort of shut, North America sort of turned off breeding in the 90s, and it's a very difficult thing to restart with an experience of the animals and the age demographics of your population. So. Great question. Oh yeah, Toronto Zoo's had 3 cubs born in the last 10 or 11 years. Yes, I do think it would in North America would add up to probably about a dozen in the last 5 years. But yeah,
And that's another great example of why it's so important to have collaborative partnerships, right? Like if somebody were to ask us that, we don't have the answer. We know we can
find out.
We can find out. We can turn to our Arctic Ambassadors Center friends. We can turn, to the SSP coordinator that we work closely with. To find folks an answer.
And we have one more question that came in that time, wondering if the bears born in captivity, will they live in captivity or will they ever be released into the wild?
Sure. There's no regulatory agency, I don't think, that would ever consider releasing a zoo-born polar bear for just a wide variety of reasons. But those bears will live in zoos and provide continuing ambassador opportunities for zoos and aquariums into the future. And the sustainability of those populations means not having to worry about where bears in zoos come from. We're producing our future ambassadors through those programs and diversifying their genetics so they remain healthy. It's a complex question for sure. It's like a whole another webinar about the future, the role of captive breeding and conservation. It's a whole nother discussion, but it's a great question.
Yes. And I think that does bring us to the end.
Yeah, we're pretty close.
The questions that I've seen. So if you think of a question later, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you everybody for attending. Big thanks again to Janet, and thank you to our panelists and Amy for leading this conversation. It's so exciting to have your expertise on staff and to hopefully be able to deepen and expand this work even more going forward, because as we can see from this conversation, it touches so many angles of conservation for wild polar bears, and it's a really important part of the work we do. We will be having another conservation happy hour. We're doing these quarterly at this point, so we'll be having another one late summer, early fall. You can expect to hear from us about that probably sometime in September or late August. And we're really looking forward to connecting with you all again there. In the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know if you have questions about this or any of our other work. And we're so grateful to everybody here on this call who's tuned into this conversation and is engaged in this work in whatever portion of the world that you operate on or within. We're really grateful for the way that you're making polar bears a part of it. And we look forward to connecting with you all again soon.